Hi again everyone. So it is 11:10. As I said, I will start now. I will record the webinar in any case, so anyone who does arrive after this will be able to access the recording. I've just started the recording in fact, and we'll take it from there. So brief introduction, my name is Joe Chiswick. I am a accessibility consultant with AbilityNet, and this is going to be a presentation webinar on an introduction to web accessibility. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system, you do have the facility via the chat panel to ask comments, make comments even. Also the question panel where you can ask questions as we go. I will keep people muted by and large just to avoid any background noise while we're going through, but feel free to ask questions via the chat panel or the questions panel as we go through the content, and I will either answer them then and there, or if it's more suitable we will perhaps delay answering it till the end, where we'll have a general wrap up and you can ask any questions that perhaps haven't been answered or you haven't thought of till then. Okay then, so the topic is accessibility, and we're really going to be talking about what accessibility is, why accessibility is important to you, and how do we get to a point where we are accessible. We have accessible content, we have accessible functionality. So to start off with, what is accessibility? Just want to set the scene. Now I'm actually going to start this off with a recording, a video of one of our accessibility evangelists, Robin Christopherson. Now, GoToWebinar has only recently introduced the facility to show videos, so I have tried this out earlier on with a colleague, but I am going to now. Okay, hi everyone. I'm not sure if anyone could see that video. I just got a bit of feedback that at least one person wasn't, so I imagine a few more people may not have been able to see or hear that video content either. What I will do is send around this presentation for you after the session, the actual PowerPoint slides, along with a link to the video which is on YouTube anyway. It's basically just one of our staff, Robin Christopherson, who is blind, and the difference that accessibility has made to him in terms of helping him find gainful employment. In fact, he credits his disability with helping him start his family, meet his wife, and so on. So really accessibility has been a real boon to him, and it's a very short but good introduction to accessibility video to watch. So I will send that around later on. For now, I will just carry on with the presentation. But as before, any questions or comments, feel free just to feedback via the chat panel or the questions panel as we go. Just to note that I do understand that there were over 50 people registered, but there have obviously been some difficulties accessing the GoToWebinar service due to downloading plugins and firewalls and probably security settings, which I know can cause these sorts of issues. If people aren't able to join live, feel free to forward questions to your line manager and they can get forwarded over to me. Okay then, so we've just looked at what is accessibility, just had that very brief introduction from Robin talking about the impact it's had on his life. Accessibility at the end of the day is about people. We will look at some of the definitions of accessibility, the technical standards that exist, but at the end of the day it is for people that we practice accessibility and who will benefit from us making and producing more accessible content. Really the ultimate goal is to make sure as many people as possible can access our website, our application, regardless of any disabilities. So depending on how familiar you are with accessibility, I just wanted to banish a few potential myths that accessibility is not only for experts. So anyone and everyone can really get involved in contributing to accessibility in a project lifecycle, whether that's from testing, development, design, managing a project, helping to create a policy, or just helping to deal with accessibility queries that the general public might come to you with. So anyone can help with accessibility. Accessibility need not be expensive. Now, You will find some quotes that say accessibility doesn't cost anything. That isn't quite true. Accessibility does cost something because you need to invest additional time in making your content accessible. If, however, you start that process at the beginning of a project lifecycle, it costs significantly less. So building accessibility in from the outset is far easier than finishing a project, finding out you've got to go back and fix some issues, and then having to retrofit accessibility into your website, into your application. So whilst it does cost something, it's actually an investment, as we'll see later on, due to the benefits that making your product accessible will have in the long term. And finally, accessibility should not be a barrier to creativity. Accessibility does not equal a plain or simple looking website. It's more about the underlying structure of websites and how they're presented to assistive technologies and other aspects we'll look at that determine how accessible a website is. So you can by all means have a very good looking and accessible website. So a few definitions of accessibility. There are thousands of definitions really, but these two came to mind. So accessibility can be viewed as the ability to access and benefit from some system or entity. And a more common one is accessibility is a measurement of the degree to which a product, device, service or environment is available to as many people as possible. Now, they don't mention the word disability explicitly there, but that's really a key part of accessibility, is that we try and make content accessible to as many people as possible, particularly people with disabilities who will otherwise have more than average difficulties accessing content. So in order to understand accessibility, it's really useful to understand what are disabilities. Now, a disability, if you look at the Equality Act, that has a definition here which is used to define a disability as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Now that's useful for a number of ways of thinking about disability, but there's a few other definitions that I prefer we'll look at later on, and I'll explain why. But that is the working model of disability according to the Equality Act. So it's really focused on long-term conditions like inherited blindness, cognitive difficulties, physical disabilities, such as cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and so on. In actual fact, there's a huge number of disabilities, and it can be overwhelming when we're trying to consider how we can cater for all these disabilities. So we actually break it down using the functional disability model, and the functional disability model really focuses on the impact that those disabilities have on people. So there might be many disabilities that affect vision, that affect motor, that affect hearing, or cognitive and comprehension. So cataracts might affect vision, various other conditions will affect vision as well, reduced vision, loss of vision completely, being colorblind, tunnel vision, and so on. In actual fact, what we're concerned with is not the disability that's causing it, but the actual end result. If it's somebody's vision that's affected, then we can look at how we can address all vision issues. Same goes for hearing, motor, and cognitive. So we break disabilities down into these four functional groups, which just helps break it down into a manageable section. So I'm just going to look through some typical issues that might affect some of these areas of disability and some of the solutions that exist for them. Now, use of colour. So if we start off looking at vision, use of colour might affect people with reduced vision or people with colour blindness. And here's a very common example. If you've ever used the London Underground, you'll see the maps everywhere are heavily reliant on colour. Now, in this first image, I just want you to look at the Oxford Circus tube station there. It has the brown line and the red line going through it, which are the central line running east to west, and the Bakerloo line running north to south. And use of colour there is very effective for people who can perceive colour. It makes it very easy for someone to instantly spot what line they need to be on and what stations it intersects, where they can get off and on and so on. However, for someone with a vision impairment who perhaps cannot perceive colour. So red-green colour blindness is a very common colour blindness, and it means that red becomes very indistinguishable from perhaps brown or green. So here's a simulated view of that same map with a colour blindness condition there, and instantly you can see that it's very difficult to distinguish the central and Bakerloo lines running through Oxford Circus. And that would mean it's a lot more difficult for people to use this map and gain any meaningful information. Sorry, I can see somebody has just commented they cannot hear anyone. I'm assuming me as well. If anyone can hear me, can you just send a quick message in the chat panel or the message panel, and I will go back to this one person who cannot hear me. See if I can help them out. Okay, thanks all. Great. So it seems most people can hear me. I'm just going to fire a quick message to this one person, but we'll have to probably carry on, I think, for today. And I will just suggest they check their headset setup. Okay, that's interesting. So somebody cannot hear me on computer audio but can on the phone. I suspect that may be a problem with the plugin, or it might also be affected by the security settings that seem to have prevented other people from actually joining the webinar as well. So I can see from my control panel that it does seem to be recording my audio. So if people cannot hear me, I'm just going to suggest they dial in fact. Okay. Okay, I will assume that everyone else can hear me now. It will be recorded, as I said anyway. So the use of colour here means that people who are colourblind cannot perceive that information within the map, which makes the map not very useful to them. Now there is a simpler way around that in this case, and this was produced by TfL, Transport for London, and it is a map that uses different types of cross-hatching, different patterns to distinguish the different lines on the underground instead. So you can see, even without colour, as this map's in black and white, you can still easily distinguish those different maps, those different tube lines. So whilst this is a physical product, the map, it does exist online, of course, as well. You can have mobile versions and so on. It's a good lesson to take on board that not all users can perceive colour. And really, I point out that we do not say avoid using colour wholesale. What we do say is to use colour, if you are going to use colour, use it in conjunction with another method for identifying information. So even the black and white map on the right could use colour as well, could use the same colours as on the first map, but the lines and the cross-hatching and the checks would make it more useful for people with colour blindness there. So a live example that I think I've looked at on some Eon content before was a chart showing somebody's electricity usage over time in the past, or perhaps the previous year or the previous quarter compared to the current quarter, and that might be a simple line chart showing month by month usage figures for gas, for electricity, and that might use one colour for last year and one colour for this year, so they're easy to distinguish. Now, for a line chart, you might want to use dotted or dashed lines, which do not have that reliance on colour again. They just rely on simple pattern matching instead. So another issue that might affect people with vision issues, people with low vision often use screen magnification software. Now, I've created an example here which is slightly exaggerated to convey the meaning. Here's a simple form, and as a sighted user, I can fairly easily see what form field matches up with what input field to the right there. So just from the alignment there, I can see which field goes with which label. Now, if I zoom in as a magnification user, all of a sudden it may be that I cannot fit both the labels and the input fields on the screen. So when you zoom in as a magnification user, you can do this in your browser just with Control and the mouse wheel up or down. And you can zoom in anywhere up to, I think, maybe 800, maybe more %. Everything gets bigger, and that includes white space as well. So you might end up with a situation where the input fields are there, but the actual labels are far away on the other side of the screen, maybe even off the screen if you've zoomed in enough. So just something to be aware of really is use of white space. It's good to space things out on a page and not have everything too condensed, but really don't have too much white space there. Realize that as people zoom in, that white space will also be increased, and it can just lead to a loss of structural information on the page. So screen readers, if you're not familiar with what a screen reader is, a screen reader is something that allows somebody who is completely blind to watch the screen and to interact with their computer. So a screen reader is a bit of software that uses synthesized speech to read out on-screen text. It not only reads out the text on the screen, but it also reads out what interactions a user can have on the screen. So it tells them where there's a button, it will tell them where content has changed on the screen. For instance, if you have an accordion or a tab panel, it will tell them when new content has been displayed on the screen. Now, here's a good example I found on the BBC website. So as a sighted user, I can see the use of those icons there tells me it's going to be sunny, but likely raining a bit as well later on this week in the area where I am in the UK, in the Midlands, in Warwick. Now, text-wise, all that information tells me is Thursday it's going to be 22 degrees high or 14 degrees low, but there isn't any text telling me what the weather is going to be like in terms of cloudy, rainy, sunny, and so on. So a screen reader, whilst it can use this synthesized speech, this text-to-speech engine to read out text and turn it into speech for me, you might be wondering how it deals with graphics and images. Now, to read out images and graphics, we provide what is called alt text, alternative text, and that is designed purely for people who cannot perceive images, whether they're blind, whether they have images turned off, and so on. But screen readers will access this alternative text information and read it out. So this second image I've displayed here, you might not be able to see the alt text there because it's very small, but in actual fact for each of those images there is alternative text saying light rain showers or light cloud or so on, and that is what's read out for a screen reader user. So they get access to all that same information as I can see as a sighted user through provision of this alternative text. There is actually a lot more to screen readers, and I do have a video I was going to show, but given that there are some people who cannot access the videos, I'm going to just send a link round instead, and you can watch that in your own time when I've sent the presentation around. But it's a good introduction from a chap on YouTube called Tommy Edison. His YouTube handle is Blind Film Critic, and he does a lot of explanatory videos on how screen readers work for him and how they work in general. And they're very, it's a very good introduction, I find, to the topic. Okay, so that's a brief overview of some typical vision issues. Now, for people with a hearing impairment, the most common issue is use of captions for multimedia. So if you have video content, you do rely on captions being provided if you cannot hear the content. So captions are very good at conveying dialogue, but it's also important that they convey sound effects, content that perhaps isn't spoken out loud but is still important to the understanding of content. So whether there is a background noise, so in this example here there's a caption saying there's bees buzzing, but whether somebody is knocking on a door, there's a car alarm going off, that can all be conveyed via captions. A difficulty that some people may not appreciate is that BSL users may have English as a secondary language. So people who are perhaps deaf with a capital D, and that signifies they consider themselves part of the deaf community, people who maybe are born without hearing, with very severe hearing loss, and they may have started using BSL before learning English. So English would be a secondary language for them, BSL, British Sign Language, would be a primary language. Now, BSL vocabulary will differ slightly in terms of grammar and vocabulary from English. So it may be when you're writing content down, try and avoid using too much jargon or terminology. If you do, have to use jargon or terminology, you can use a glossary. I mean, one example we found a few years ago, was found by the BBC rather, when they did some research onto their recipe site, was the use of the word marinade, which they use fairly often, did not have a BSL equivalent. Now the BBC are very good at accessibility in general, so they instead added it to a glossary. So even if you can't get the meaning of the word, you can look it up and it will be described in words you can understand. So that's one way of tackling that issue. For people who do have, they're perhaps hard of hearing, they're slightly or mildly hearing impaired, it's useful to ensure there's good contrast between foreground and background audio. So when you're recording dialogue, make sure you're not recording audio next to a, with a train or something else in the background. Just pay attention to when you're producing videos, if you do produce videos for your site, on that type of issue. So ensuring that there's good audible contrast. Dialogue is not going to be drowned out by any background audio. And for physical disabilities, a very common issue is that, particularly for people with Parkinson's, reduced dexterity through aging and so on, is that people have difficulty clicking on very small targets like checkboxes and so on. People with physical disabilities are likely to use a keyboard to navigate, because if you have difficulty holding a mouse very steady with Parkinson's, instead of keyboard you can just tab through a page, which is the primary keyboard navigation method, and you don't need to worry about holding a mouse steady. You can instead just take your hands away from the keyboard and nothing will happen while you're not doing anything. Keyboard users and people with physical impairments can have difficulty with very sensitive flyout menus. So some menus you have to hover the mouse over them and progress into them, and in turn submenus will expand and so on, and that can be a very difficult interaction method for people who have difficulty holding the mouse steady. So in those cases, perhaps a click to open menu is more useful, or just adjusting the sensitivity of flyout menus so they're not quite so quick to close when users move the mouse off them. And people with physical disabilities might also be using voice recognition. Now they use a say what they see approach to using voice recognition. If they want to click on a link, they simply say the name of the link and their voice recognition software will click it. Where there are buttons on a page, such as continue or submit or next, move to a next page, they will say the name of that button. And it's important, if you have graphical buttons, that the alternative text, the text underneath that button, matches what the visible button says as well, because that is what a voice recognition user will say and what their software will search for on the page to try and activate that button. So if you have a continue button that's actually got alt text of go, it will cause problems for people using this approach. And people with cognitive difficulties such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, memory difficulties, comprehension and learning difficulties and so on. People who find it difficult to read text particularly will benefit from using headings. Headings, bullet points, even images or videos to break up text. A very common difficulty for people with dyslexia is that words will flow into one another. We've got some illustration here illustrating how it can be perceived, how words can be perceived to some types of dyslexia. Everyone has slightly different needs, but this is one perception that people might have of text as it appears to actually move around, making it very difficult to read on the page. It's also useful to avoid center justification. That just causes different spacing to appear between words if you have full justification, and good contrast just means black text on a white background, or avoiding light grey text on a dark grey background is probably a better way of thinking about it. So ensuring pretty decent contrast, and we'll look later on at methods of how you can evaluate contrast. Now, we looked at one definition of disability, but here's another one which I prefer, that a disability is the outcome of the interaction between a person and the environmental and attitudinal barriers they may face. And this really summarizes the social model of disability, in that people are disabled through their environment, and that changes can be made to their environment to make it more accessible for them. Now, I'm just going to go through some examples of how that actually works. So here we've got a few personas that we use when we're carrying out accessibility testing. So this is Gwen. Gwen's been blind since birth, and she considers herself as an expert JAWS user. JAWS is a very popular screen reader. It stands for Job Access with Speech, and she comfortably uses headings and links to navigate content. So as a sighted user, when you read content on a page, it's unlikely you read every single word when you're looking for a specific bit of content. It's likely that you will skim read, look for headings, bullet points, and other quick to read bits of content, looking for some key phrases or keywords, and then you will use that method to drill down and find useful content on a page for you. Screen readers in general provide a approach for blind users to follow, where they can just quickly cycle through all of the headings on a page. So in this page, we've just got the one heading, Gwen, but they can use headings to quickly skim through content and find something relevant to them. So Gwen is comfortable using headings to navigate through a page. Now, Gwen might be blind, but she can be disabled by forms that use capture images. Now, I find capture images annoying, and many other people do who would not consider themselves to be disabled, but they are particularly problematic for someone who is a screen reader user, who has difficulty reading in any case, because they are difficult to interpret, and if they are a barrier to completing a form, that can be a showstopper for some people. When structured markup is not used on pages, so when headings are missing from a page, that can cause huge problems for a screen reader user. It means effectively the whole page is a wall of text. There's no structure there for them to follow. And of course, if you cannot see the screen, you cannot use the mouse because you can't see the mouse cursor. So you rely on being able to access everything via the keyboard. If there's content that is not keyboard accessible, menus, links, video players and so on, that means as a keyboard user, you will not be able to access that content. So in all those cases, Gwen will be, even though Gwen has no vision, she's being disabled by the page not making these simple changes to accommodate her. So Andrew has been deaf since his early 20s, so BSL would not be his primary language, but he does use BSL, and he uses lip reading mainly, but occasionally BSL with other deaf people. So he otherwise has a good grasp of English. It has been his primary language for many years. Now, Andrew is going to be disabled by video content that has no captions and audio content such as podcasts that do not have a transcript or a script for them, and also video captions which are not correct. So if you use YouTube, you can actually use it to automatically create captions. It will do some wonderful speech to text conversion, and it will attempt to create captions for you automatically. If you do use that approach, which can be very time saving, but then do not go through and check the captions are correct, that will cause problems for people. So it's important that captions, once you created them, are checked, that they are correct against the video, and that they occur at the right time as well. So it's no use talking about something that hasn't yet happened on the screen via captions, because it won't make sense to people. And finally, Johnny is a wheelchair user. He relies on keyboard for interaction because he cannot use a mouse. And he finds it difficult using the keyboard anyway. He still sometimes hits the wrong keys. Now, he benefits from using a skip link. A skip link is a link on a page that allows users to skip right past navigation blocks. Otherwise, they might have to manually tab through every link at the top of a page on every page. And he also uses Dragon Naturally Speaking, a voice recognition package, which I mentioned briefly a short while ago, when he's not too tired. Because they rely on your voice having a consistent pattern, not all users will find it easy to use a voice recognition package when they are tired, because it will affect their voice. So Johnny is going to be disabled by websites that are not keyboard accessible. If they're not keyboard accessible, he will not be able to use them. Forms that don't give useful error messages, because he finds it easy to accidentally hit the wrong key, it's going to be easy for him to introduce errors when he's completing forms. And if there's no useful error messages, so I've seen error messages that just say, please complete the error, please address the error to continue, rather than your last name should not have any spaces, or your phone number should not have any A through Z characters, or so on. And because he uses voice recognition, wherever there's images of text, such as this continue button, it has alternative text which matches it. So in this case, this continue button should have alt text of continue rather than proceed to allow him to access that. This second definition of disability we looked at as a result of being social and environmental barriers also allows us to include temporary impairments which aren't covered by the Equality Act definition. So temporary impairments might cover a broken bone affecting mobility. So somebody might be a standard mouse user, then they sprain their wrist, break their arm, and all of a sudden they cannot use their mouse effectively, so they're having to use a keyboard. And that's only going to be a temporary condition, but they're still going to have the same difficulties as someone with a long-term condition. Migraines can affect concentration, of course. So again, people who have reading difficulties might be experiencing some of the same sorts of difficulties as someone with a migraine. And someone who's lost their glasses, that will of course affect vision. So people will find it difficult to read very small text and so on. There's also environmental issues as well. So using a mobile, obviously mobiles, tablets, designed to be easy to use and carried around with you. But if you're using one outside in poor lighting conditions or very bright lighting conditions, it's going to be more difficult to read that text on the screen, particularly if it's already low contrast. If you're watching a news article in a very noisy office, you might not want to either turn your speakers up or you might not have headphones handy, so you're going to rely on captions being present. So again, you're going to be experiencing the same difficulties as someone with a hearing impairment there. And one that affects me, I travel to London a fair bit, I try and work on the train, but it's a very crowded train all the time, and I hate using the trackpad on my laptop. So I try and make use of keyboard shortcuts for everything. Now, if I can't do something with the keyboard, that means I have to use the trackpad, which can be frustrating. It means I might find something else to do instead. But that's another environmental issue. And of course, there's age-related disabilities and difficulties as well. So reduced dexterity often comes with age, increased age, as does loss of eyesight, affected hearing, and memory difficulties. Now, if you ask somebody who's experiencing these, an elderly person who's experiencing reduced dexterity, they're not likely to say they are disabled. They're likely to say, well, that's what happens when you get older. You start to lose your eyesight, you start to lose your dexterity. That's not a problem, it's just what happens. So they benefit from being able to zoom in on web pages, you know, maybe having a larger mouse cursor, but generally they will experience some or all of these difficulties later on in life. So I find it useful to think of accessibility as designing for our future selves in many ways, because chances are we're all going to experience some disability throughout our life at some point. So we're really all going to benefit from making these changes. So we've looked at some of the difficulties and the disabilities relating to accessibility. So I just want to spend a short while looking at why accessibility is important. What are the reasons that we look to be more accessible? First and foremost, I hope you agree it's the right thing to do. So it's social inclusion. Giving access to more people can only be a good thing, particularly people with disabilities who, in many ways, they're less likely to be in employment, and giving them access to information and the internet in general can be a life changer in many ways. Giving access to communication, and people who cannot leave the house easily, can pay bills, can interact with support and help via the website. It can be very useful for a number of reasons. So it's the right thing to do, is really the first and foremost reason. From an organisational point of view, it demonstrates social responsibility as well. So it's something you can talk about and promote. Accessibility is something we do for these reasons. If you're trying to sell the business case to other people as well, you're a developer, designer, so on, you need to persuade managers or other people for accessibility buy-in. There's some other financial reasons which are good to promote as well. So accessibility really does make for good business. Now, I've got the figure there of 212 billion. That is the combined income in 2014 of households with a disabled person. So that is a lot of money, and if you're able to tap into that market, and they call it the purple pound, the disabled spending power in the UK, that is a lot of money. I mean, some of the reasons that really, when you're making a website more accessible and usable for people with disabilities, it makes it easier for everybody, for some of the reasons we've already looked at. Part of accessibility is making sure content works across different devices as well. So different mobiles, different tablets and so on. People are going to have a similar experience regardless of what device they're using. So that enables more people to access your content as well. And disability communities and forums are good at sharing amongst themselves content and solutions that work very well. So websites that are very accessible will get shared around in the same way that inaccessible websites might be discussed and people are advised to find something different. So there's many reasons why accessibility is a good business decision to make. Also, accessibility helps equate to good SEO, good search engine optimization. So we talked a bit about screen readers. Now, search engines use search engine spiders, search engine bots to search and index sites, and a search engine bot or spider cannot see visibly your website. They rely on the code and the markup that they can access, and they access it in a very similar way to a screen reader. So if you have a video, a search engine bot will not be able to watch the video or listen to the video. They will instead maybe have access to a caption stream or a transcript. They cannot look at an image, but they can instead read the image alt text. So by providing those alternatives for reasons of accessibility, you're also helping to benefit SEO as well. And finally, accessibility is obviously a legal requirement. So we mentioned the Equality Act before, but under the Equality Act, organisations have a duty to make what are called reasonable adjustments to enable disabled people to access websites and services. Now, the phrasing there is rather deliberately vague when it states reasonable adjustments, and that's really because what is reasonable for one person to do may not be reasonable for another. To give an example, an organisation such as Aon, with potentially many thousands of employees, will have greater resources to make things accessible than perhaps a person running a business by themselves out of their bedroom. They might have just one or two people working for them, putting websites together and selling products and so on. They're going to have less resources to make an accessible website and so on. So it really comes down to what resources you're able to devote to making content accessible. But there is this statutory obligation under the Equality Act to make these reasonable adjustments. Just a bit of background on the legal casework then. So in the UK, there have been a few cases brought by the RNIB against inaccessible websites. These were BMI Baby a few years back. Despite repeated requests for changes to be made, BMI Baby refused to make necessary changes to their website, particularly for blind people, through provision of alt text, and RNIB started a court case against them. In the end, they actually settled out of court, but even if you do not go the whole distance with a court case, it's going to affect your business bottom line regardless. Even if you win a court case, there's going to be negative publicity associated with that. So, and often cases will get settled out of court because people do not want to go all the way and risk having precedent set or judgment against them or whatnot. So that's why there are very few cases that you can find information on. There's more in America, such as the Target case, and that was still a number of years ago, where they had, I think it was a $6 million class action suit awarded against them. And more recently, Netflix have been through a few legal hoops where they've been taken to court over provision of audio description for blind users. So audio description in the same way that captions describe on-screen content to hearing impaired users, audio description describes content that is not being spoken about but is still happening and important to understand a scene. And it was seen as necessary for Netflix to provide audio descriptions. And in fact, captions as well was another class action suit against Netflix. They're the more recent cases in the US. So it's important to be aware of the legal aspect of accessibility as well. Okay, so some of the reasons, those are some of the reasons to become more accessible. So how do we get there? What is our route to becoming more accessible? For websites and digital accessibility, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines should probably be our first port of call. They are created by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and they apply not only to web pages, HTML pages, but also to other content hosted on your website, videos, PDFs, Word documents, and so on. And if you work internationally, you'll find in many countries, even if they have local accessibility legislation, that will largely be based on WCAG2 in any case. So by addressing them from the outset and striving to adopt WCAG2 as your own accessibility standards, you'll be making it easier to introduce that content and work in other countries as well. So WCAG has 4 really useful principles. It's overriding principles from which all their other checkpoints and guidelines are derived. And these have the, I don't know, somewhat unfortunate, the acronym POUR, P-O-U-R, but that stands for POUR. P is perceivable, so users should be able to perceive all content, and that includes alt text, captions for hearing impaired people, alt text for blind users. O is for operate, in as much as users should be able to operate web pages with a keyboard, with voice recognition, regardless of what device they're using, they should be able to interact with web pages. U is understandable, so web pages should be understandable, and that means that when you're having forms and form errors, they should be read out in plain text. You should make sure that headings are defined sensibly, so you have short and succinct headings rather than very lengthy headings with lots of filler words and not much content or keywords. And finally, robust, which is the shortest of the principles in terms of how many guidelines it has, covers the fact that content should work on different browsers, on different devices, and it doesn't say everything needs to look exactly identical, but it does say that users should have a similar experience across those devices as well. So those are the key principles that are worth remembering by that handy acronym. And as I said, all of the guidelines and guidance is derived from those principles. In terms of practical advice I would give, if you're embarking on a project, it's useful to have a key member of staff to be the go-to person for accessibility of a project. That is, they are aware of what guidelines they need to follow, what difficulties people have had with the website or application in the past, if indeed it's a new version of a website or application. They can oversee accessibility testing and so on. It's just useful to have one point of call where all of the accessibility information can congregate and gather. It's useful to provide training for designers, developers in some of the basic accessibility requirements. There's online courses that provide this, there's various organisations that come on site and provide training, and some of the webinars we'll be running for you in the future will go into more detail for design and development, much more detail than the surface which I'm just scratching today really. We will look at more in-depth content for designers, developers and testers and so on, but that's something else to consider. And if you are commissioning third-party products, so you might have an agency developing a microsite for you or commissioned to do videos or so on, there's a really useful British standards document, BS 8878, which has guidance on how to ensure that companies you're working with can follow accessibility. So it gives you questions to ask, questionnaires to send to them, checklists to work through to ensure that any work you've had done is accessible, and how to incorporate accessibility requirements into any contracts you're providing for people you work with, any subcontractors as well. So it's a really useful document to be aware of if you're a manager or you're in the position where you're commissioning work. In terms of integration and accessibility, I said before that accessibility is really something that should span a project duration. It's not a step that exists at the end of a project, because you will find if you get to the end of a project and then do accessibility testing and you have lots of changes to make, it will be costly. So really you should be looking to integrate accessibility work right from the very design stage. Even the requirements gathering, you can look at accessibility. You can then start doing testing very early on. As soon as you've got functional pages, they can be standalone pages of an app or a website, you can start doing testing. Expert AT testing, so AT refers to assistive technology such as the keyboards, voice recognition, screen readers and so on, and you can do that sort of testing throughout the project as well. And then once you've got towards the end of a project, you can do actual disabled user testing. So you might do UAT or user acceptance testing at the moment, but you can also incorporate disabled users into that approach as well, and that's a really useful method of doing real-world accessibility testing. In terms of user testing, chances are you have employees with disabilities as well. You might have screen reader users, users with dyslexia, and so on. And it can be worth seeing if they want to help with any testing of prototypes, because you can do in-house testing, particularly for sites that are and websites that are developed for internal use. It's going to be more difficult to find external users who can help review those, because you need a certain familiarity with intranet websites anyway, or in-house systems. So it's useful to see if employees can help with that. As I said before, you can incorporate disabled users into any user acceptance testing, and you can outsource user testing as well wholesale. There's various UX agencies and user testing agencies, including websites where you can actually commission disabled users directly to look at content for you. Some brief guidance for developers, particularly web development, is using semantic and valid markup. So using code that follows formal established guidelines is a great way of being accessible from the outset. Certainly following the web content guidelines, they have lots of examples on the website. They've got a wiki which is slowly growing in size with lots of examples as well, telling you exactly how to do things in an accessible way. If you have rich and dynamic content, interactive content particularly, ARIA is a set of technologies you should look into. It's really an extension to HTML. It allows you to make interactive and rich dynamic content more accessible, particularly for people with screen readers. And really useful good practice anyway is having a pattern library. So if you're creating new components, new widgets for your website, such as a calendar or these graphs I mentioned that show your previous and next quarter predicted usage of electricity or gas, then you can create reusable components that you can then use on multiple websites. Once you've spent the time to make the first one accessible, it's simply a case of then just dragging and dropping that into other websites to make use of it, and you already know it's accessible. Progressive enhancement is a really good approach as well. With progressive enhancement, you start with a very basic system, and then you gradually build on top of it with in the case of web development, it would be starting off with the HTML, then enhancing with CSS, with JavaScript, with ARIA, and so on. So even if somebody's assistive technology or browser or mobile phone or device does not support all of the technologies you're using, they can access at the very least the most basic version of the content, which gives them enough to get by. If they do have a supporting device, they will be able to see all the bells and whistles you've incorporated and make use of that as well. But that is really the ethos behind progressive enhancement and why it's a really good technique to use. So this example taken from comedian Mitch Hedberg, who commented, an escalator can never break, it can only become stairs. And that's a really good analogy. Stairs are so basic, they have no moving parts. You can enhance them by turning them into an escalator to make them easier to use, but even if it stops working, everyone can still use the stairs in that case. Accessibility and design then. So it's really useful to have a good colour palette to ensure good contrast for accessibility and for text. We looked briefly at contrast earlier on and the use of colour. Having a consistency of appearance throughout a site as well, so making sure it's easy for users to tell when they switch from one page to another page they're on the same site. In that case, they instinctively know that the search is going to be at the top right, the sitemap is at the bottom left, and so on. Just makes it easier for users with a cognitive disability particularly, but generally all users will benefit from that. Using a clear layout and structure also helps people with reading difficulties, with cognitive difficulties, to prevent the pages becoming too overwhelming. So using white space sparingly because of the reasons I mentioned before, but do use white space to prevent pages appearing too cluttered. And just to reiterate, design for your future self. Consider, your future self might have reduced vision, reduced dexterity, and so on. How might you address that at the design stage by paying attention to colours used, to amount of white space, to how you're going to present videos, and so on. Okay, I just want to talk about some practical methods where you can try out accessibility testing as well. So there's I do accessibility testing virtually full-time. I've arranged for access to a range of tools, specialist tools, but actually there's a lot you can do without any of these tools or with freely available tools, which I'm just going to talk about now. So keyboard testing is probably one of the key tests that I do, and you don't need any special technology for that, just access to a keyboard. And the typical things I would test for on a website is that there is a logical tab order. There is a visible focus outline. By that I just mean that as you're tabbing through a page, you can easily see where you are. All content is accessible, so all menus, if you can use a mouse to click it, then you can access it with a keyboard as well. And also skip links. So if you don't want to tab through all the content on a web page, you can just use a skip link to bypass it. Now I'm just going to show you what I mean with a few of these, so hopefully I can get a couple of examples up, and hopefully you can see this as I switch to Internet Explorer. And I'm actually just going to open the BBC website. Now if I start tabbing into the page, and I'll do this relatively slowly, so I'm in the address bar, and then I go to the refresh button, the tab, and if I keep pressing tab I will progress into the page. So now I'm on the BBC logo. You might just be able to spot the dotted outline around it. If I continue tabbing, a hidden link suddenly pops into focus titled Skip to Content. Now if I ignore that and just carry on, I have to tab through news, sport, weather, iPlayer, and so on, and these links are at the top of every page. So as I'm navigating through the site, if I want to read content halfway down a page, I'm going to need to tab through these links on every single page. If I just shift tab to go backwards, again to this skipped content link, I can press enter and that instantly jumps me straight past all of the header navigation. So you can just use that technique to bypass navigation on pages. On the BBC site it's not so bad. There's maybe 5 to 10 links to bypass. On other websites I've seen it upwards of 60 or 70 links in the main navigation, which otherwise I'd have to tab through every time. Now again, it's easy to see where I am because as you tab around the page, the current links and news headlines there, followed by China trying extremely hard on climate, they change colour, they display a dotted outline around them telling me which one has got the focus. And it's also going through in a very logical order as well. So I read from top to bottom, from left to right, and that's the order in which I tab through content as well. Now, if I just instead go to the Coca-Cola website, which is one I've found to be somewhat lacking in keyboard accessibility in the past. If I start tabbing into this site, and this is something you can do yourself, so I'm actually tabbing through. If you can see the status bar at the bottom of my browser, you can see every time I press tab, so tab, 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 the page moves around, the status bar updates to show the current link, but I cannot see on the page what link is selected at all. and that's because they have removed that functionality via CSS. So they've actually removed that, and I suspect it's not through deliberately removing it, it's through the designers there not implementing it after they've used like what we call a reset style sheet to reset the styles before they make their own on the page. So just by omitting that key factor, they've made the page practically impossible for a keyboard user to access, and that is a very simple change. Just to illustrate how simple that is, so if I just jump into Notepad, in order to fix that on the website, all of the code I would need would be something like for keyboard users, it would be using Focus, this Focus CSS pseudo class, and I would just give all links a solid 2-pixel red border, and that bit of code there would make everything on the website be much more usable. So I can simulate that with a bit of software I've got called the A Viewer. Hopefully that works. It doesn't seem to be appearing on my page. Let me just quit it and try again. Okay, the A Viewer does not seem to work for me at the moment, but what that does is it simulates a large focus outline. So as I tab through the page, I can easily see where I am on the page at any one time. Okay, so keyboard testing is very easy to do. The first thing you should do is lose your mouse. I suggest unplugging it so you're not tempted to use it, but at the very least hide it or move it away from where you normally use it. And then you can actually just test a web page virtually with only 2 keys, Tab and Enter. Tab will go through the whole page in a very linear order from beginning to end, focusing on links or other controls, and Enter will select the current control. So you can do a lot of testing just with those 2 keys. In some cases you might find you need the arrow keys. You might want to do Shift and Tab at the same time, which actually steps backwards in the tab order, but you can do a lot just with those keys. So that's something you can easily test when you're developing a page or when you're looking at a page for a colleague who's developing a page. You can quite easily do some keyboard testing. Ensure that things have a logical tab order, as I said. So on the CodeCoder website, this is how it should appear. Starting off there, if you can see this image properly, starting off at the top left, it goes through the country and contact us, then the search, then it goes through to the main menu, and then it goes through to the sub menu, and then it goes into the page and so on. Now in actual fact, on the CodeCoder website, it does not do that. It actually jumps from where number 1 is to number 4 to number 2 to number 3, and if you're not expecting it, that's going to be very confusing, because you will find when you're using a keyboard, you naturally look to the next thing on the page where you expect the focus to be going to, and when it doesn't do that, it can be very disorienting, especially when you're always looking around trying to find where the focus is. A visible focus outline, so ensuring that it's easy to see where you are as a keyboard user is very useful. As a mouse user, of course, you can follow the mouse cursor around, but for keyboard users, they rely on the web page telling them where they are. So in this case, the shop link is selected, and I can tell that it's not only got a dotted outline, but it's got a solid yellow background, so it's very easy to spot. As I tab backwards or forwards, the jobs or tickets links would become selected, and they would then display that yellow background and dotted border. So it's very easy to spot on this website, Smashing Magazine website. In contrast to the CodeCoder website, where there is no indicator of what is selected, and it's a very simple change, but it makes things so much more usable for keyboard users. The Web Accessibility Toolbar is it's a freely available tool that you have access to. You might need to check with your IT department if you have any security restrictions on your laptops, which I guess is likely, but it'd be worth seeing if you can get an exemption for this tool. So this is the toolbar I've got in Internet Explorer here. And what that does, I'm just going to bring up another website to try this, but CodeCoder one might be a bit overwhelming. But what I can do there is quite easily show the alt text and get an alt text report for all images on the page. So it's telling me there's no images missing alt attributes. If I click OK, notice that a lot of these images are actually going to be background images, so they don't require alt text. But where we've got these logos here, they've got a blank alt text attribute because they've got descriptive text below them. But if I instead go to the weather website, and again let's look at alt text, you can see this example I showed earlier where you've got the weather described there, rain, showers, sunny intervals and so on. And in fact, if I zoom in, you can see the map there. It's giving you all of the key information for the map there, so it tells you the location and the weather there, which you get visually. It's just conveying that same information for screen reader users. So that's a really useful aspect of that toolbar. Something else it can do is actually highlight the headings on a page. Very useful if you're a developer, you want to check, if you've marked up a heading properly. So I can see here that's heading level 2, UK Today, features and analysis. Here we've got some images without alt text, so that is bad. That's something that the BBC should address. It's relatively minor in this case, I suspect, but it's still something that they will no doubt look to address. Other things the toolbar can do, it's actually got a colour contrast analyzer built into it, so all that does is pop up a little application, and all it does is it has a little point and click dropper, so you can select a foreground colour for that text there, so that weather for the week ahead link. You select the foreground colour, the text colour and the background colour, and it will tell you what the contrast ratio is. So you can hopefully see there it's got a contrast ratio of 5.4 to 1, and it tells me that is a pass at AA level. So that is the minimum you should be looking to pass for standard text. So that's a really useful set of tools, and that's only for Internet Explorer, but there are similar tools for Firefox, for Chrome as well. So Wave by WebAIM is another really useful tool. Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, and it actually exists in two forms. There's a Chrome browser plugin, and that's probably going to be more useful for you because you can use that to scan pages behind a firewall. The other version is the web-based version where you can just easily go and put in any URL, bbc.co.uk, and then it will scan that and display the results here. Because that's a web-based version, the content it's scanning needs to be publicly accessible. If instead you use Firefox, then you have the Wave tool here. For instance, I can, let me just check the Trainline website maybe. I can quickly run the Wave tool there, and I can run a check on pages that are perhaps firewalled away. They're not publicly accessible, and I still get this useful feedback. So it covers the page in these useful icons, green indicating positive, yellow potential problems, and then if there's any red on the page, they indicate a definite problem. Other checks you can do if you're doing any responsive design, any mobile design, you can use VoiceOver on iOS. VoiceOver is a built-in screen reader, and it is a primary method of testing mobile content for accessibility. So it's very simple. It has a practice mode and a sort of training mode. It's available from your settings, general, and then accessibility section of your iOS device, and it really is very simple to use. I'll send a link round to the video I was going to show you, which talks about how a touchscreen can be used by somebody who cannot see the screen. And if you've never tried it before, it's well worth exploring, because it's quite fascinating how you would make a touchscreen accessible. But in fact, it's one of the more accessible phones on the market at all now. For Windows and desktop computers, you can use, I talked about JAWS earlier on, Job Access with Speech, a screen reader. That is very expensive. You're talking maybe £1,000 for a single user license. Now you might well have an organization license for it, that depends, but otherwise you can use NVDA, non-visual desktop access, which is a open source and free screen reader. It's very powerful. It has a lot of keyboard shortcuts, as you would expect, because it gives access to virtually the entire computer ecosystem. But again, as with keyboard testing, you can do a lot of screen reader testing with only a small number of keys. So you don't need to understand the whole package in order to do basic testing with it. So that's free. You'll easily find it if you just Google or search for NVDA. I'll show you briefly the color contrast analyzer. You can download a standalone version as well if your primary job is design and you just want to quickly check colours, you can download a standalone version of that app, and it just gives you a very simple pass-fail against any colours you put in there. This is a tool that I don't use very often, but if you do any flashing content, so video content is very useful for analysing. Flashing content can be a particular problem for people with photosensitive epilepsy, and this tool will simply screen record the page and then will give you an indication of if that's going to be problematic for people with photosensitive epilepsy. So it gives you a little chart plotted as it records the page, and above, if you can just see in that screenshot, it has a fail or pass mark at the bottom there. Anything that goes above the pass mark, crosses that black line, is deemed a failure, and it suggests you then change that content to until it passes. So that's how you can evaluate content that might otherwise cause seizures. Like I said, I've been doing accessibility testing for the better part of 10 years, and I think I found one failure in that time for flashing content. That's mainly because many people are going to find flashing content extremely annoying and make anything difficult to read. So people try and avoid it when they're designing content as well, which is why it's rarely a practical issue. When you're evaluating forms, you don't even need any software here. You can actually interact with forms and just try submitting them without any data. That's one of the ways I test, or submit them with obviously incorrect data, put letters where a phone number is expected, and then see how the form reacts. Do the error messages make sense to you? Do the can you fix the form and fix the data you've entered based on the errors that have been described to you? Are they described in plain English? Is it easy to identify where the errors are on the form? Obviously, all instructions should be clear as well, so you should be told from the outset where you need to put the phone number in, what fields are required, and so on. Okay, so that's just a brief run through of how you can test things for accessibility as well. I'm not expecting anyone to remember all of that, but if you do need to, you can have a look through the slides when I send them out, and they'll give you a prompt. Like I said, a lot of those methods don't need either any specific software, or if you do need software, it's often freely available online, so you can easily carry some of this out as part of your day-to-day work. Okay, so really that's it. That's run through the three sections. What accessibility is, why we do accessibility, who benefits, people with disabilities, but broadly everyone benefits. So I'll summarize very quickly that accessibility, again, is really covering the ability to access and benefit from systems and content. It's for all users, but particularly for people with a disability who will otherwise have greater difficulty accessing content. It's great for promoting social inclusion, but it also makes good business sense, giving access to the disposable income of disabled people, which is a lot of money in the UK. On top of that, it's a legal requirement as well. And in order to become more accessible, the standards should be the first port of call. They're your roadmap to accessibility, but there are some ways you can implement and incorporate accessibility into your development. Starting off from designs, providing training for designers in and looking at developing an accessible color palette and so on. And really realizing that accessibility is all about keeping accessibility in mind throughout the whole development process and life cycle. It's not something that you bolt onto the end of a project, because if you do that, you're going to have a bad time later on when you try and fix things that would have been much easier identified at the outset of a project. So that's not to say if you've already nearly finished a project, don't do accessibility. Obviously do it, and then any lessons learned you can incorporate into the next round of the project and really start it from the beginning there. I'm just going to finish off with a really nice quote from it's quite an old quote now from the IBM training manual. But for people without disabilities, technology makes things easier. But for people with disabilities, technology makes things possible. And that was from 1991. And that's the approach IBM were taking then. So nowadays it's become even more intrinsic to people with disabilities in society, the difference that technology can make to make their lives easier and better. So that is the power of accessibility, really. Okay, so that's been a whistle-stop tour of some key aspects of accessibility. I hope it's been useful. I haven't gone on too much and I've covered things in enough depth. There are going to be some follow-up webinars which are focusing in more detail on how to carry out testing, how to do design, how to develop, writing an accessibility policy and so on. But this was really an introductory session to accessibility. So I will pause and stop speaking now and probably grab a glass of water while I mute my mic, but if we do have any questions, feel free to either enter them into the chat panel or the questions panel. If you do have any questions later on, I can't recall the name of the person who commissioned the webinar, but if you feedback via line manager or where whoever emailed you to set up the webinar, you can get any questions to me then. Okay. Right, so I see one question come in. I'll just give it a second. Okay, so a question has come in. Is there a checklist or criteria that you can get your website to meet that caters for the majority of disability categories, or do you have to cater for each category individually? Okay, that's a very good question. I'm just going to preface that by saying, whilst I've talked about the importance of accessibility, it is very rare indeed, it's practically impossible to make something that is going to be 100% accessible to every single user, because there are so many different user needs and requirements and so on, that the best you can do is really to make it accessible, do the best you can, and realize that you will not be able to cater for every single user. That said, in terms of a list, let me just see if I get this page up. Hopefully you can see this reference page. This is a list of all the WCAG, the World Wide Web Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and this is the checklist that we use for reviewing websites. Now, text might be very small, so if I zoom in you can probably see some of these a bit more, but that has checkpoints for, and notice that these are governed by the 4 principles I mentioned earlier, the POUR, poor, perceivable, operable, understandable and robust, and they have checkpoints relating to keyboard. So there is a keyboard checkpoint there, and that relates to people, that will cover people not only who are blind screen reader users, but also people with a physical impairment as well. There are a separate checkpoint, for instance, use of colour, which I demonstrated with the Transport for London Underground map as well, and also for captions as well. So this is the checklist I would suggest you make use of. It can be applied to applications as well, particularly mobile apps. There's only a few of the checkpoints which will not be relevant or will be difficult to check against if you have a mobile app compared to a website. But really, this list of checkpoints is what I would suggest you use as the basis for creating a checklist. So I'm quite happy to send a link round to this checklist or a more comprehensive online one. For a simpler checklist, there is actually the IBM software accessibility checklist, which is, I'll be honest, it's very similar, but whilst the web content guidelines were developed for websites, the IBM software checklist was developed for applications. And it incorporates a lot of WCAG now, and actually it might have been updated to fully incorporate WCAG. So actually it goes beyond the web content guidelines, but I would hazard a guess it's going to be very similar. So I would first of all, for websites, look at WCAG. If you need to go beyond that, you can look at the IBM guidelines for applications, but really this set will get you 99% of the way there. I hope that answers your question, Joseph, but if not, I'm happy to talk about that a bit more. Like I said, I can send around a link to any of that as well. Okay, a follow-up question. So can any of the accessibility testing tools we've recommended be incorporated into automated testing scripts, or do they have to be tested manually? Okay, that's a really good question. So the Wave tool I mentioned, that is very useful for one-off testing. That will only do testing one page at a time. If you're testing a whole website, that will be very time-consuming indeed. One tool that I have used is called Tenon. Now, this is designed exactly to be incorporated into your testing workflow, into any unit testing and the automated testing that you do. And it's designed to be incorporated at the development stage. So you can actually, it has many ways of incorporating it into your workflow via Selenium scripts. It can be set up to, so I'm just reading this straight from the page because it's been a while since I've used it, but it hooks into systems like Jira, GitHub, and it's essentially an API. So it does a lot of accessibility testing for you. It gives some good results, and it's a cheap service, to be honest. You will pay a cost for it, but you can do some one-off testing, just individual pages free, but you can then have a license and start using it as much as you like within your organization. So you would install it onto your test server and then run it from there via API calls, and it would hook up to many testing frameworks. There are some other more commercial and enterprise level testing tools that will similarly allow you to do much more comprehensive automated testing. So I'm trying to think of a few of those. So there's one called Axe, which is by an organization called DQ. That's one that I have used a fair bit for web testing. It's essentially, at one level, it's a browser extension that allows you to do one-off pages, but Axe itself is a back-end JavaScript built testing framework, and there are ways you can incorporate it into, so it's an accessibility engine, so you can actually incorporate it in other ways into your testing framework as well, and that allows you to do automated testing, you know, from start to end of processes with testing scripts and test workflows through submitting forms and that type of thing as well. So Axe I would look at, Tenon.io I would look at as well. They'd probably be the main ones to integrate into your testing workflow. But really, because I only use those on an intermittent basis, I would look at those websites for more information. So I'm quite happy I can just pop those in the, let me just send those in the answer to you. So Joseph, you've asked about those, but what I'll do is I'll just copy you the links into the answer panel, and then actually I'll put it into the chat panel in case anyone else wants to have a look as well. Okay, so I'll just put that in the chat panel. Anyone can access those. And they're really useful for script-based testing. Yeah, another good question actually. So how does somebody design a password input field on their website to cater for blind people? Actually, the simple thing is you just design it as you would a normal password input field. So you do input type password, and that will obscure, that will ensure that visibly the password field is obscured. You will find on, for instance, mobile phones, when people are entering their password, it will not read out the characters being echoed unless there are headphones plugged in, and even then you've got control over it via the accessibility options, I believe. But otherwise, if I'm using the NVDA screen reader, for instance, if I go into a password field, because NVDA queries the page and it knows it's a password field different from a text input field, whilst I can navigate the keyboard okay, every time I enter a character, it just reads it out as star or asterisk. So just going off at a slight tangent, we recommend anybody who is losing their sight or is likely to become a screen reader user that they learn to touch type as a matter of course. So we expect anyone who's going to be using a screen reader to have become a touch typist if at all possible. So they will be very familiar with their QWERTY keyboard, and they will not perhaps need the level of support in terms of telling them what key they're on when they're inputting a password. So you don't need to do anything different from a development or design point of view. Just implement a password field as per normal. The only additional requirements I would suggest are, often nowadays you will have additional requirements for passwords, such that, you know, a password field might say, please enter your password here, or please choose a password, and then alongside it, it will say this must be 6 characters, you know, 4 letters, an uppercase character, a number, a Chinese character, and so on. And that information needs to be made accessible to a screen reader user. You can do that in various ways. As a sighted user, I can see it alongside the password field, but unless it's marked up properly, perhaps a screen reader user won't know of those requirements until they submit the form, and then it says your password does not meet our requirements. They might then be prompted to go and look for them. So that's something else to bear in mind. But back to your original question, you don't need to do a whole lot other than use a standard password field. That will work, you know, virtually all of the time in the correct way for screen reader users. Sure. So the next question then, if people aren't reading the chat panel, I mentioned a cascading style script, a CSS reset style sheet. So a reset style sheet, because browsers will, you know, when I say browsers, I mean Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari. All these different browsers will have different default ways of implementing standard controls, such as a button, you know, maybe the default font they use, and so on. So if I don't do anything, if I just write up a very simple page, and I'm designing a page and I want to put a button on that page, I might do something simple like this bit of code here. So input type equals button. And that might look, even though it's the same bit of code, that will look slightly differently on each browser. So Safari might draw that with a rounded corners, Internet Explorer might have a drop shadow, and so on. When we use what is called a reset style sheet, style sheets govern how web pages look and feel. A reset style sheet will basically ensure that all browsers display things in the same way. So it resets all of the browser styles to a common baseline. And they're very common amongst designers and developers when they're creating a new website, because it makes things easy. You don't need to have code that says, if you're in Internet Explorer, use this type of button, and if you're on Chrome, do this type of button. It really just creates a blank slate for designers to work on. Now, the problem with a reset style sheet is that it does some things, like it will have, and I'll explain what this means, it might have a declaration that says a hover or a focus outline none. Now, all that does, if I tab around this website here, you can see that yellow border hopefully appearing as I tab between the show options and analyze your web page. That is some CSS that allows me as a keyboard user to see where I am on the page. A reset style sheet will remove that functionality, and it relies on you as a designer putting it back in. If you do not put it back in, it will mean that keyboard users will be disadvantaged, and because they won't be able to see the focus. So really, a reset style sheet, going back to the original question, just wipes the slate clean, sets all the styles to be the same across different browsers. But it just comes with a few caveats to be aware of when using them for accessibility purposes. Great. Okay. Any other questions? Like I said, if you think of any questions straight after this session, you can always email me anyway. I'm quite happy. What I'll do actually, I'm quite happy for direct questions. I'll just pop my email address in the chat panel, and then people can get in touch direct anyway. But if you do go via your manager or whoever commissioned the webinar, then it may be that any feedback I send out can go around everybody, so everyone benefits from those questions and answers. Okay, What I will do then, I'll just mute myself and leave the webinar open for a few more minutes in case anyone does have any questions. But if you do not, thanks for attending. I hope it's been useful. I will just, I should have started one of these at the beginning. I've just got a quick poll just to see, just to get a bit of feedback in terms of how you might look at accessibility going forwards. And if you do have any feedback in any case, feel free to email it direct to me or just go back via your manager as well. It's always useful to get feedback on actually the webinar content and how useful it is and how interesting some of it is as well. It can be a difficult topic to make extremely interesting, but hopefully that was a good introduction for you all anyway. So thanks for attending. I'm just going to mute my mic now, but I will be here in the background for a few minutes. Otherwise, you can probably finish early and head off for your lunch. Okay, so another question then. Was the cross-hatched underground map a tailor-made solution, or is there some sort of cross-hatching or grayscale guideline on WCAG2? Okay, that's sort of a two-part question, I guess. The cross-hatched underground map was tailor-made, but it was done by TfL because they did get feedback from people who are colourblind who are having difficulty with the map. In terms of the requirement under WCAG, there is a checkpoint or success criteria, as they're called, for use of colour. And it simply says, I'll read this out, colour is not used as the only visual means of conveying information or distinguishing a visual element. So there is a relevant WCAG2 entry that will relate it to that map. And that guideline then, in conjunction with user feedback, caused them to develop that tailor-made solution. So I hope that answers that in a relatively straightforward fashion. I think at one time the alternative London Underground map was developed by a third party because they had difficulty using the actual live map, but in time that got subsumed and integrated by TfL into their actual map offering. So it was created probably by an individual who had difficulty before, to be honest, but as time went on it was seen as a good thing, and so it was adopted by the broad London Underground web team. Great, okay, thank you.